I was the third long-range communications operator at Proxima 7 Station when it all began. A routine shift, monitoring background noise from the galactic core, the standard work I had been doing for the past 2 years. Then suddenly, all my screens exploded with red indicators at once. A signal was coming from Sagittarius A, from the very heart of the black hole, a place where, by definition, no information can escape. It wasn't a random spike, not interference. It was a structured, repeating sequence across all frequencies simultaneously. At first I thought the equipment had failed, but diagnostics showed all systems were operating normally. The signal was real. I called the senior officer, and within 10 minutes, our small station turned into a beehive. Military personnel arrived, scientists, and some people in black jumpsuits with no insignia. I was pulled away from my console and forced to sign non-disclosure papers right there on the spot. I spent the next 3 days in isolation on the same station while specialists worked through the data. Through the ventilation system, I caught fragments of conversations. Something about the signal being decrypted simultaneously by 3 major powers. About coordinates, about some kind of artifact inside the event horizon. When they finally released me, the station commander looked like he hadn't slept the entire time. He told me I had to forget everything I'd seen. But at the same time, I was handed transfer orders to a military ship, effective immediately. No explanations, no choice. 6 hours later, I was already aboard a heavy Earth fleet cruiser, hastily assembled somewhere beyond Mars's orbit. The entire ship buzzed with rumors. The crew was being pulled together from all over the galaxy, people dragged back from leave and from their families, experimental equipment loaded that hadn't even completed testing. At the briefing, Admiral Vane, a hard woman with an icy stare, showed us the decrypted message. Coordinates for an entry point into the black hole and a promise of what they called the Thorn Throne, a device created by an ancient race capable of manipulating timelines, rewriting history, canceling events, changing the past of entire civilizations. I sat in the hall among 300 other specialists, thinking it was nonsense, science fiction. But the faces of the command staff said otherwise. They believed it. Worse than that, they were afraid other powers would reach the artifact first. We were shown intelligence reports. The crystalline conclave was assembling a fleet of phase ships at the edge of its territory. The hive mind was growing bioorganic dreadnoughts the size of moons. Vane said we were entering a race where the winner would gain absolute control over reality, and the losers would simply cease to exist, erased from history. When the briefing ended, I stepped into the corridor and tried to contact my family on Earth, but all external channels were blocked. Top-level military secrecy. I stood by a viewport and watched dozens of other ships gathering around our dreadnought, the full might of the Earth fleet, concentrated for a single suicide mission. My stomach twisted as I realized I no longer had any control over my own life. Some ancient civilization had left a trap at the center of the galaxy, and now all the major powers of space were rushing toward the prize without thinking about the consequences. I remembered my father's words, an old asteroid miner. If something seems too good to be true, it usually is. But it was already too late to turn back. The fleet jumped into hyperspace, heading for Sagittarius A, and I was part of this madness. We dropped out of hyperspace in the last beacon system, and I immediately knew everything had gone wrong. My communications console screamed under the flood of signals. 2 more fleets had materialized near us. To the left, at a distance of barely 200,000 kilometers, ships of the crystalline conclave appeared, about 20 phase cruisers, flickering at the edge of reality as if they existed in several dimensions at once. To the right unfolded a true nightmare, the bioorganic leviathan of the hive mind, a living creature the size of a small moon, covered in thousands of pulsating tendrils and glowing sores. Clouds of smaller combat organisms swarmed around it. The three greatest powers of the galaxy had ended up in the same point in space, all moving toward the same goal. On the bridge, a dead silence lasted for about 10 seconds, and then Admiral Vane ordered shields up and all weapons charged. Diplomatic channels opened almost instantly. I heard the negotiations through my headset. Representatives of all three sides were trying to agree on a joint passage, a division of the find, anything at all to avoid a fight. But every phrase sounded like a threat. Every proposal hid an attempt to buy time or gain an advantage. The conclave demanded that we withdraw and recognize their claim, citing some ancient treaties. The Hive didn't negotiate in any conventional sense at all. Their representative transmitted only biochemical patterns and psi signals that our translators could barely interpret. The Earth fleet held its ground. We received the coordinates first, which meant we had the right to proceed. I sat at my console watching the negotiation timer count down the final minutes as the distance between the fleets slowly closed. All three armadas drifted toward the center of the system, toward the transition point into the next sector. The crystalline ships fired first. One of their cruisers vanished from normal space and reappeared directly in the middle of our formation, unleashing a volley of phase torpedoes at our flagship. The temporal shield of the dreadnought Kronos activated. The torpedoes slowed in distorted time and detonated seconds before impact, but the shockwave still slammed into the nearby destroyers. Two ships tore themselves apart right before my eyes on the main display. After that, it turned into a slaughter. The Earth fleet opened massive fire on the conclave. The Hive unleashed clouds of biomunitions at both sides at once. Crystalline ships teleported between volleys, appearing in the most unexpected places. I was shouting coordinates into the microphone, trying to help our fighters orient themselves in the chaos, but the sensors couldn't process the data fast enough. Space around us became hell. Explosions, debris, and energy discharges everywhere. The battle lasted 4 hours, though it felt like an eternity. I saw the Hive's Leviathan launch a tentacle thousands of kilometers long and literally tear one of our cruisers in half. I saw a conclave phase ship collapse inward on itself after taking a hit from our Singularity torpedo. I saw Hive organisms devour the hulls of crystalline vessels, turning metal into organic mass. By the end of the fight, all three fleets had lost a third of their forces, but no one retreated. Admiral Vane ordered the surviving ships to regroup and continue toward the black hole. The others did the same. We pressed on, leaving behind a field of wreckage and thousands of bodies drifting in the vacuum. That was when I realized the Thorn Throne had already begun killing people, even though we hadn't come anywhere near it yet. And this was only the beginning. When we approached the anomalous zone around Sagittarius A4, all my instruments started showing complete nonsense. Sensors detected objects that didn't exist. Coordinates changed every second, and timestamps jumped back and forth as if time itself had gone insane. On my screen, I saw the wreckage of a ship bearing our own markings, drifting in space, and I was about to report it when I looked closer. The ship was intact and flying in formation 200 kilometers from us. I was seeing its wreckage from a future that hadn't happened yet. Minutes later, distress signals began coming in on emergency frequencies, voices screaming about hull breaches and decompression. But when I tried to locate the sources, those ships were still undamaged. We were flying through some kind of temporal slurry, where past, present, and future were mixed into a single nightmare. The chief navigator lost his bearings and had to be replaced. The guy just stared at the screen and kept repeating that we were already dead. Admiral Vane locked herself in the command briefing room with the scientists, and over the service channel, I could hear them arguing about the nature of the anomaly. Space-time around the black hole was being distorted, not by natural gravitational forces, but by something artificial, some kind of technology that layered different points in time on top of each other. One of the physicists said we were existing in several moments at once, that every action we took created echoes in the past and the future. I didn't understand half of their terminology, but the meaning was clear. We had entered a zone where cause and effect no longer worked properly. The Conclave and Hive fleets had stopped as well, their ships drifting several light minutes away from us, clearly dealing with the same problems. For a short time, even attempts to attack each other ceased. Everyone was too busy trying not to lose their sanity from the instrument readings and not crash into invisible gravitational anomalies. Vane found it first. I remember how she came out of the command room with an expression like she had seen a ghost, a mix of terror and triumph. She ordered all operators to switch to a special scanning frequency, and that's when I saw it on my screen. A stable corridor cutting through the chaos, a gravitational funnel of perfect geometric shape leading straight to the event horizon. From a physics standpoint, it was impossible. A black hole cannot have a stable entry point. But ancient technology was somehow keeping this tunnel open. The structure looked like a spiral of intertwined gravitational lines, rotating counterclockwise and pulsing in sync with some invisible rhythm. Vane ordered the fleet to prepare for entry, but before she could finish the sentence, the Conclave and the Hive detected the corridor as well. All three fleets turned at the same time and rushed toward the funnel at maximum speed. I managed to strap myself in 3 seconds before it started. Gravitational tides slammed into the ship with such force that the hull screamed and groaned like something alive. My console was ripped from its mounts, along with half the equipment on the bridge. People who weren't secured were thrown into bulkheads. Through the viewport, I saw our formation break apart. Ships were flung in different directions by invisible forces. Some simply vanished, as if erased from reality. Others were stretched and warped into impossible shapes. One destroyer flew past us, moving forward and backward through time at the same moment. I saw it enter the funnel and exit it simultaneously. The temporal shield of the Kronos cracked under the overload. Red indicators burned across the bridge. The last thing I remember before losing consciousness was the sensation of being torn apart into atoms and compressed into a single point at the same time, and the thought that I would never see Earth again. I came to with someone shaking my shoulder and shouting for me to look through the viewport. My head was splitting, blood was running from my nose, but I forced myself to look and forgot how to breathe. We were inside the black hole, which was impossible in itself, but what I saw was even more impossible. A city the size of a star system stretched out before us, a gigantic metropolis of colossal spires and platforms, suspended inside a frozen accretion disk. Matter around it was locked in halted motion, streams of gas and dust frozen mid-fall, forming incredible patterns lit from within by some soft glow. The city itself shone with thousands of lights, structures extending for millions of kilometers, connected by bridges and arches on such a scale that our dreadnought looked like a grain of sand beside them. I understood that I was looking at the creation of a civilization that surpassed anything we could imagine. Scanners showed a complete absence of life. The city was dead, possibly for millions of years, but its systems were still operating. Lights were on, energy fields held the structures in place, and some mechanisms were moving deep inside the spires. We drifted through this impossible space, along with the remnants of all three fleets. The Kronos made it through the funnel, but out of 30 ships, only 7 remained with us. Ships of the Conclave and the Hive had broken through as well, 3 or 4 vessels from each faction, all damaged, all having lost most of their strength. Vane called an emergency briefing and announced that we were deploying reconnaissance teams to the nearest structure. I wasn't a trooper, but I was included as a communications specialist. Someone had to maintain contact with the ship. An hour later, I was sitting in a drop shuttle with 20 Marines, flying toward one of the spires towering above us like a mountain of metal and crystal. When we landed on a platform several kilometers wide, the first thing I felt was absolute silence. No wind, no ambient noise, only the hum of our equipment and breathing inside helmets. The surrounding structures were covered in inscriptions and symbols glowing with a faint blue light. The walls looked like metal and something organic at the same time. We moved through corridors hundreds of meters high, our lights pulling fragments of incomprehensible architecture out of the darkness. The scientist in our group, Dr. Chen, found what she called a recording device, a crystalline node embedded in the wall. When she touched it, holograms appeared in the air, three-dimensional images of the beings who built this city. The Archons looked humanoid, but their bodies were semi-transparent, as if woven from light and time itself. The recording showed their civilization at its peak, cities spanning galaxies, technologies that altered the very structure of reality. Chen continued playing the records, and the story grew darker. The Archons learned to manipulate causality, rewrite events, change the past. They became gods of time, and that was what destroyed them. The final recording showed a catastrophe, an attempt to alter the fundamental laws of the universe. Something went wrong, and their entire race began dissolving into temporal currents, breaking apart into paradoxes. They realized they couldn't stop the process and made the decision to seal the source of their power in the central cathedral of the city, in a place they called the Thorn Throne. The recording ended as the last Archons walked toward the cathedral, knowing they would not return. I stood in that dead corridor watching holograms of an extinct race, thinking only one thing. We had come here for the same artifact that destroyed its creators. And there were three factions ready to kill each other for the right to repeat their mistake. We hadn't even returned to the ship when scanners detected movement in other sectors of the city. Conclave and Hive landing teams had deployed on neighboring spires and were moving in the same direction we were, toward the central cathedral, whose coordinates Chen pulled from the Archon records. Over the comms, Vane ordered us to keep moving and not let the other factions get ahead of us. The race had begun. We ran through the corridors of the dead city, our boots echoing on ancient floors, and shots rang out behind us. Someone from the Conclave had teleported directly into our sector and opened fire. Crystalline warriors materialized out of nowhere, their phase rifles leaving holes in reality where they fired. 2 of our Marines were killed in the first seconds, simply ceased to exist when caught in a phase discharge. We took cover behind massive columns and returned fire. But the enemies vanished before bullets could reach them, reappearing in other parts of the corridor. Our team leader, Captain Reeves, made the only right call. We couldn't win a fight against an enemy that could teleport, so we broke into a run, leaving automated turrets behind as cover. The city turned into a maze of deadly chases and brief firefights. We ran into hive bioforms in narrow passages, human-sized creatures covered in chitin armor, armed with organic weapons firing acid and bioplasma. One of them leapt at our medic and dissolved his armor in seconds with its secretions. I emptied a full magazine into the creature, but it kept moving until Reeves blew its head apart with a grenade. We lost people at every step, left the wounded behind, because there was no time to evacuate them. The scanner showed 12 kilometers to the cathedral in a straight line, but we were moving through spiral corridors and bridges, winding between titanic structures. Ahead, flashes of gunfire flickered. Other teams were also forcing their way to the center, killing everyone in their path. We were 3 kilometers from the cathedral when real madness began. A group of figures in Earth military armor burst out of a side corridor, and for a second, I thought it was reinforcements, until I saw the commander's face through the visor. It was Captain Reeves. The same Reeves who was standing next to me, shouting orders. 2 identical squads, 2 identical commanders, and they opened fire on each other without warning. I dropped to the floor, trying to understand what was happening, and saw myself among the attackers. My face, my armor, the same rifle in my hands. My double was aiming straight at me, and I fired first, hitting him in the chest. He fell, blood pouring inside his helmet, and I understood. This wasn't a hologram, not a robot, but a real person, my copy from another timeline. The Archons had left a trap, a temporal defense system that created clones from parallel realities and sent them to kill the originals. Across the entire city, battles were breaking out between people and themselves. The next 2 hours became the most horrifying experience of my life. We fought copies of ourselves who knew all our tactics and weaknesses because they were us. I killed 3 more of my doubles, each time feeling something break inside my head. I saw Reeves fighting his clone hand to hand, both of them falling from a bridge into the abyss between spires. I saw a crystalline warrior fighting 5 of his own copies, their phase weapons triggering chain reactions that tore space apart around them. Hive bioforms devoured their own doubles, absorbing their biomass and becoming larger and more dangerous. By the time we reached the square in front of the cathedral, only 5 of the original 20 in our group were left, including me. The Conclave and the Hive had suffered monstrous losses as well. I saw piles of bodies, ours and theirs, copies and originals, and I could no longer tell which were real. The central cathedral loomed before us, a massive structure shaped like a crown of thorns, pulsing with distortions of reality. Somewhere inside it was the Thorn Throne, and I no longer knew whether it was worth all these deaths. We broke into the throne hall last, and what I saw made me stop at the threshold. The hall was the size of a small city, its walls disappearing somewhere far above, and at the center hovered the Thorn Throne itself. It wasn't a chair or a platform. It was a machine of unimaginable scale, a quantum processor the size of a moon, made up of billions of interwoven structures that moved and rotated, forming dizzying patterns. The air around it vibrated with distortions of reality. I could see space folding and unfolding, time flowing in different directions at once. Admiral Vane was already there, standing on the edge of a massive platform before the throne, with the remnants of her guard. Opposite her stood Kristurk Zevhor, a being of pure light in humanoid form, surrounded by his warriors. On the third side was the Hive's brood seer, a pulsating biomass the size of a tank, from which extended tendrils with sensory nodes. 3 commanders, 3 factions, and 1 artifact for all of them. I tied my headset into the shared negotiation channel and listened as they tried to reach an agreement. Vane proposed creating a joint committee to study and use the throne, to divide its capabilities among all races. The brood seer transmitted biochemical patterns that our translators interpreted as agreement to a temporary truce and cooperative research. Zevhor also agreed, his voice sounding like crystal music, speaking of the need for caution and wisdom. But I was watching my scanner readouts, watching one of the crystalline warriors slowly activate something beneath his phase armor, the energy signature rising with every second. I tried to warn Vane, but I was too late. Zevhor gave the command, and his warrior detonated a phase charge they had carried with them. The explosion was directional. A wave of distorted space slammed into Earth forces and Hive bioforms alike, tearing bodies and structures apart, erasing matter from reality. The shockwave hurled me dozens of meters away. I slammed into a wall and blacked out for a few seconds. When my vision returned, half the hall was destroyed. Bodies were everywhere. Vane was bleeding out, pinned to the floor by debris, and the brood seer writhed, its biomass shredded to pieces. The crystalline warriors were moving toward the throne, Zevhor floating ahead of them, already extending a glowing limb toward the artifact's central console. And then the throne awakened. The pulsing of its structures accelerated 1,000-fold, and a burst of energy erupted from its core with such intensity that all sensors were blinded. I felt reality around me begin to come apart, time tearing itself to pieces. Zevhor screamed, the first and last time I ever heard a being of pure light express terror. And then, the temporal wave swept over all of us, and the world exploded into 1,000 distorted moments. I was falling through time. I saw myself on Earth as a child, saw my first shift at Proxima 7 station, saw the moment we entered the gravitational funnel, saw myself old and dying in some future that had not yet happened. Everything was happening at once, past and future merged into a single impossible flow. I saw Vane standing whole and unharmed, then saw her corpse, then alive again, but in different armor, from another timeline. Zevhor multiplied into dozens of copies, each from a different moment of his life, all screaming and reaching for the throne. The Broodseer broke apart into individual organisms existing in different time periods. The throne defended itself, hurling us back along our own timelines, forcing us to relive everything that was and everything that could have been. I saw a version of myself who died in the first battle at the last beacon, a version who never left Earth, a version who became an admiral and led fleets in an entirely different war. And somewhere between all these lives, I understood. We had awakened something that was never meant to be disturbed, a defense system capable of tearing us into paradoxes and scattering us across every possible reality. When the temporal wave released me, I was lying on the floor of the throne hall, unable to tell how much time had passed, a second or an eternity. Around me, something impossible was happening. I saw Admiral Vane in 3 places at once. One was bleeding beneath debris, just as I remembered after the explosion. Another stood whole and unharmed at the throne's console. The third, older, with a scar running across her entire face, was gripping the younger version by the shoulders, desperately saying something to her. I couldn't hear the words, but I saw terror in both their eyes. Zevhor had split into many glowing silhouettes, each from a different point in his life, and they were fighting each other, their phase weapons tearing space apart. The Broodseer writhed on the floor, its biomass pulsing and changing color, images surfacing across its surface. I saw entire hive worlds burning in some future, consumed by fire. The throne kept generating waves of distortion, each new pulse throwing us farther along our timelines. I tried to stand and saw myself a few meters away. But it wasn't me now. That double was about 20 years older, his face carved with scars, his eyes empty, the eyes of someone who had endured too much. He looked at me and slowly shook his head, as if warning me. I stepped toward him, wanting to ask what would happen to me, but he vanished, dissolving into the air, and another version appeared in his place. Me in a coffin, dead, my chest blown open. Then another. Me laughing with some woman on Earth, in a life I never had. Dozens of my versions flickered around me, all from different timelines, and I realized the throne was showing me all possible fates at once. Through the hall's viewports, I saw what was happening in orbit, and it was even worse. Fleets from different points in time were fighting there. I recognized our Kronos, intact, firing on its own wreckage, which had not yet been destroyed, but already existed in this warped space. Conclave ships appeared and vanished, fighting themselves from past and future, their phase torpedoes triggering chains of paradoxes. The hive Leviathan was simultaneously whole and torn apart, its tendrils stretching through time, grabbing ships that did not yet exist or had already ceased to exist. I watched one of our cruisers explode, then reform, then explode again, trapped in a loop of the same moment. My helmet sensors showed total chaos, timestamps jumping from several hours in the past to several days in the future, coordinates changing every second, cause and effect relationships ripping apart. Reality was literally collapsing under the weight of all these paradoxes, space cracking and warping, opening holes in the fabric of the universe. I stood on the floor of the throne hall, surrounded by ghosts of possible pasts and futures, and the only thing I could think was that we had gone too far. We had awakened a force that would destroy not only us, but reality itself around this place. I crawled toward the nearest console, trying to re-establish contact with the ship, with anyone who could explain how to stop this. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold the equipment. Temporal echoes swept around me. Soldiers from different timelines, fighting enemies that weren't there. Cries for help from the past, mixing with warnings from the future. I caught one signal, clean and stable amid all the chaos. It was Vane, the older scarred version, broadcasting on all frequencies. I only caught fragments through the interference, but the meaning was clear. She had seen what came next. She had come from the future to warn that the throne could not be used, only destroyed. Every second it remained active. It broke down the barriers between timelines. Soon, the entire sector of the galaxy would collapse into a single, massive temporal singularity, where past, present, and future would merge into a nightmare of paradoxes. I looked at the pulsing throne and understood. We were not winners. We were dead people who simply hadn't realized it yet. I reached the throne's central console, clawing over debris and pushing through distortions of reality. Admiral Vane, the younger version who was still alive, was already there, her hands moving across holographic control panels, trying to access the artifact's memory. I saw her expression change second by second, hope in her eyes turning into horror. She found something deep within the system, some kind of record, and when she activated it, the entire throne hall filled with holographic images. I saw the Archons in their final moments, not as majestic gods of time, but as terrified beings who realized they had done something irreversible. The recording showed how they tried to rewrite the fundamental laws of causality, how they wanted to erase the very concept of entropy from the universe. Instead, they tore the fabric of time, creating a hole in causality through which chaos poured in. The Archons did not vanish or die. They dissolved into temporal currents, became part of time itself. Their consciousnesses shattered into infinite fragments, scattered across the entire history of the universe. Vane played the records further, and I saw the Archons' final decision. They realized they could not stop the collapse they had triggered, so they built the throne, not as an instrument of power, but as a prison, a gigantic stabilizer holding the temporal singularity in a frozen state. This entire machine, this entire city inside the black hole, was one massive cage for a destructive force that could annihilate the galaxy. The last Archons sealed themselves inside the throne, along with the singularity, sacrificing themselves to contain the catastrophe. The signal we received at Proxima 7 was not an invitation. It was a trap, the final act of desperation of a dying race. They knew that sooner or later someone would find their city and try to use the throne, and then everything would begin again. Every attempt to activate the artifact weakened the seals, releasing waves of causal collapse. We did not open a treasure vault. We cracked open a grave and awakened something that was meant to remain buried forever. Vane turned toward me, and I saw in her eyes the same expression her older version had, an understanding of the price of what had to be done. She told me over a direct comm channel that there was only one way to stop the collapse: to destroy the throne completely, to shatter the entire stabilizing system and let the black hole consume the singularity along with the whole city. But that meant all of us would be trapped here forever, inside the event horizon, with no way out. The gravitational corridor we came through existed only because of the throne's energy. Once it was destroyed, the exit would collapse. All ships, all survivors of the three factions would be sealed inside this impossible space, doomed to die here. I stood in front of her, trying to find another option, some loophole. But deep down, I knew there wasn't one. We came here for the power to rewrite reality, and were given a choice between our own deaths and the destruction of the galaxy. A ridiculous choice for a communications operator who just wanted to retire quietly on a remote station. I looked at the monitors showing chaos in orbit. Ships from different timelines were still fighting, tearing reality apart with every shot. I looked at the throne, pulsing with waves of distortion, at the walls of the hall covered in the writings of a dead race. I remembered the faces of the people I started this mission with. Most of them were already dead, torn apart by temporal clones or erased from reality by paradoxes. I remembered Earth, the family I never got to see one last time, the life that would never be. And I understood that Vane was right. We had no choice. The Archons tried to become gods and turned into a warning for everyone who came after them. They left us a lesson written in their own disappearance. Some boundaries cannot be crossed. Some powers are too dangerous to control. I nodded to Vane, agreeing to what was essentially a death sentence for all of us, and she began transmitting a message to the commanders of the other two factions. It was time to decide. Would we die alone in this trap, or take half the galaxy with us? Vane opened a wideband broadcast on all frequencies, cutting through the temporal interference, and began transmitting the Archon records to everyone: the Earth Fleet, the Conclave, the Hive. Through my headset, I heard her explaining the situation to the faction leaders, her voice calm, almost indifferent, the voice of someone who had accepted the inevitable. She showed them the data proving that the throne was actually a prison, that every second of its activity brought the collapse of the entire galactic sector closer, that the only way to stop the catastrophe was to destroy the artifact and remain here forever. For the first few minutes, the channel was silent. I could almost physically feel the commanders processing the information, grasping the scale of the threat and the price of survival. Then Zevhor spoke, not the fractured chaos of multiple versions, but a single, unified being. His voice strained. He said the Conclave was ready for sacrifice, that it was better to die with honor than to allow the universe to fall apart. The Broodseer transmitted a biochemical pattern of agreement. The Hive accepted the terms as well. The next 10 minutes were the strangest of my life. 3 hostile factions that had been tearing each other apart moments ago began coordinating a joint operation to destroy the very thing they had come for. Tactical officers from all 3 sides worked on a unified attack plan, exchanging data on the throne's weak points, the city's structural nodes, and where charges needed to be placed for maximum effect. I relayed coordinates between teams, synchronized timers, helped configure the shared communications network. It was absurd. Yesterday we were killing each other, and now we were sharing classified military technologies for a common goal. The fleets in orbit ceased fire. Ships from different timelines slowly formed a firing formation, targeting the throne. Earth dreadnoughts charged singularity torpedoes. Crystalline cruisers prepared phase disruptors. Hive bioships swelled with gravitational drills. Landing teams from all factions gathered in the throne hall, preparing to place chrono charges at critical points. I looked at this impossible alliance and thought, it's a shame it took standing on the edge of annihilation to learn how to work together. Vane gave the order to begin, and the world erupted in fire. Orbital bombardment started simultaneously. Hundreds of torpedoes and energy strikes slammed into the throne, punching through its defensive fields. Through the external cameras, I saw the ancient machine shudder under the blows, its structures beginning to collapse, reality distortions around it growing even more chaotic. With the remnants of the landing teams, we ran through the city's corridors, planting chrono charges at nodes of the energy network. Earth combat engineers worked side by side with crystalline technicians and hive bioengineers. No one fired a shot. Everyone focused on the task. Each charge was tuned to a specific frequency. They all had to detonate at once to create a wave that would tear apart the throne's stabilizing field. I was installing one of the charges in a massive energy node when I felt the floor beneath my feet begin to vibrate. The system was failing. The city was dying along with its heart. Temporal loops began collapsing one by one. I watched ghosts from other timelines vanish as reality slowly returned to a single flow. I felt the detonation of all the charges more than I heard it. The shockwave passed through space-time itself, making every atom in my body vibrate on the edge of destruction. The throne shattered, its colossal structures collapsing and releasing final waves of distortion. The city began falling into the black hole itself. Gravity intensified 1,000-fold, and I felt myself being pulled downward with everything else. Vane was shouting evacuation orders over the comms. Everyone still alive was running for ships and fighters. I reached a landing platform and saw the last transport leaving without me. There was no room. Nearby stood a crystalline fighter, its pilot already inside, but he gestured for me to climb in. I jumped into the cockpit with a being that had been my enemy just yesterday, and we shot upward, forcing our way through the collapsing city structures. Titanic spires fell around us. Entire sectors of the megacity vanished into darkness. I saw ships that didn't make it, dragged into collapsing space. The gravitational corridor really was closing, the exit shrinking with every second. Out of the entire fleet, only fighters and light shuttles escaped. Dreadnoughts and heavy cruisers were left behind, consumed by the black hole along with the city of the Archons. A month after we escaped the event horizon, I sat in the conference hall of the neutral Omega Prime station, looking at representatives of the three powers gathered at one table. Admiral Vane looked 10 years older, even though only a month had passed. Gray streaks in her hair, new lines around her eyes, the gaze of someone who had lost too many people. Beside her sat Zevhor, his luminous form dimmer than before, as if burned out from within. The hive's brood seer attended via holographic projection. Its physical body was still recovering from its injuries. All three factions had lost their flagships. Thousands of their best soldiers and officers were buried inside the black hole with the city of the Archons. Out of the 300 people who left aboard the Kronos, 23 survived, including me. The Conclave lost 70% of its expeditionary fleet. The Hive lost 2 queens and hundreds of thousands of combat organisms. We sat in that hall not as victors, but as survivors of a disaster we ourselves had caused. And now, it was up to us to make sure no one ever repeated our mistake. The Sagittarius Accord took 3 days to sign. Lawyers and diplomats from all sides argued over every word and every clause. But the core was simple and undeniable. Any technology of temporal manipulation was declared forbidden within all three powers. Its development and use classified as crimes against sentient life. A quarantine zone with a radius of 50 light-years around Sagittarius A Force was established. No expeditions were allowed to enter without special permission from a unified council. A joint patrol service made up of representatives from all factions was created to enforce the accord and prevent attempts to breach the restricted zone. Vane was appointed to lead this service. A bitter irony. The very woman who led us to the throne was now tasked with protecting the galaxy from such artifacts. When the signing ceremony ended, I stood by the station's panoramic window, staring at the stars, thinking that we really had changed something. Maybe those deaths weren't meaningless. Maybe we had saved future generations from the temptation to rewrite reality. But deep down, I knew. People never learn from someone else's mistakes. I stayed on with the patrol service, returned to what I did best, monitoring signals and coordinating communications. My new title was Senior Long-Range Reconnaissance Operator. It sounded impressive, but in practice I was doing the same job as at Proxima 7, only now I was watching for anomalies across an entire sector. Vane kept me close, saying I was one of the few who had seen the throne firsthand and understood what we were looking for. The first weeks were quiet. Routine scans, false alarms, ordinary work. But I knew that in the classified archives of all three powers, fragments of Archon data still existed, pieces of information copied before the throne was destroyed. Officially, everything had been erased, but I didn't believe the military and scientists had truly let go of that knowledge. Somewhere in sealed laboratories, someone was studying those fragments, trying to understand the principles of temporal technology. The Sagittarius Accord looked solid on paper, but in reality humans, crystalline beings, and the Hive remained the same. Curious, ambitious, willing to take risks for an advantage over rivals. The signal came 6 weeks after the treaty was signed, at 3 a.m. station time. I was alone on shift, checking background noise from deep space, when the computer emitted a warning tone. Anomalous activity detected by long-range sensors in the direction of the Andromeda cluster. I increased the resolution, ran the data through every filter, and felt a chill sink into my bones. The signal pattern was identical to the one we received from Sagittarius A4. The same structure, the same frequencies, the same repeating sequences. Only the source was 2.5 million light-years away, in another galaxy. I contacted Vane immediately, woke her in the middle of the night, and sent her the data. I heard her swear for the first time since I'd known her, then a long pause. She ordered me to tell no one about the discovery, to classify the recording at the highest level, and to wait for her in the command briefing room. When she arrived, her face was pale, her hands trembling. We sat there staring at the screen, at the signal from another galaxy, and both understood what it meant. The Thorn Throne was not unique. The Archons had built more than one prison for temporal singularities. There were more of them, maybe dozens, maybe hundreds, scattered across the universe. And sooner or later, someone would find the next one, and it would all begin again. We didn't finish the race. We only won the first round.